Thank you to everyone that is joining right on time. We will give all the other participants about 2 to 3 minutes and we shall be able to start very soon. Thank you. I think we have enough participants to start now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. I know it's morning in DC, it's afternoon in London, and it's evening in somewhere in East Africa. So good morning to everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Africa Legal Support Facility in this very important conversation on infrastructure upgrades post-pandemic. My name is Prima Tugonza. I'm a legal counsel at the ALSF, and I am honored to be your moderator today. As you're all aware, African governments have been grappling with the uncharted waters that have been COVID-19. Everything PPPs has taken a really big hit, starting from project preparation to procurement and to implementation. And with the end hopefully in sight, fingers crossed, governments need to consider different recovery options and to accelerate these recovery options. As many of you may be aware, the ALSF provides transaction advisory support to African governments in their negotiations with the private sector. We know that our role is going to be even more critical in the coming months when governments need to not only renegotiate projects, but they're going to need to change strategy altogether. On that note, today we are joined by a panel of highly esteemed experts. They are known to many of you and they need absolutely no introduction, but I will do them the disservice of giving them a small introduction. Our first panelist today is Mr. Mark Mosley. Mark is the owner and principal of Mosley Infrastructure Advisory Services, which is a global consulting firm. Mark has previously served as the Chief Operating Officer of the Global Infrastructure Hub, and he's also served as the lead counsel of the Infrastructure Practice Group at the World Bank. Welcome, Mark. Dr. John Tambi is a transport infrastructure expert with more than 40 years of experience. Dr. Tambi is a very good friend of the ALSF. He serves as the chairman of the Office of the Presidential Infrastructure Unit in the Republic of Sierra Leone. Dr. Tambi is also the presidential advisor on infrastructure projects in Sierra Leone, so we can rest assured that everything we say here will reach the ear of the president. Welcome, Dr. Tambi. Ms. Beatrice Ikilai is currently the Vice Chair at the Bureau of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's Working Party on PPPs, based in Geneva, Switzerland. Beatrice is also the co-president of the Africa PPP Network, which is a network that brings together Africa PPP units, professionals, and practitioners across the continent. It's very good to have you today, Beatrice. Ms. Rachel Spate is a partner in the banking and finance practice of an international law firm called Mayer Brown, based in their London office. Rachel particularly focuses on the natural resources finance sector and has experience in infrastructure finance in areas including road, rail, and the healthcare sector. And she's worked on various PPP projects and she has supported the ALSF on many of our PPP projects. It's good to have you today, Rachel. Lastly, but definitely not least, David Baxter is an internationally recognized consultant with over 25 years of experience in all things PPPs. David is currently engaged as the senior advisor by the UNECE International PPP Sustainable Resilience Center, where he serves as a sustainability advisor on advancing PPP best practices. David is also a steering committee member of the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. Welcome, David. So I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. We look forward to interacting with you. I also want to welcome all the participants who have joined us from all over the world. Before we jump right into it, please note that this is an interactive session. You may ask questions in the chat bar, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. There's also a Q&A bar, which you might also ask questions in. There are people at the back end that will forward these questions, and in a Q&A session of about 15 minutes, we will try to respond to as many questions as we can. Please feel free to address them to any panelists of your choice, and if not, we will direct them to the panelist we think is most suited to answer that question. Please note also that our session today is being recorded and will be available on various ALSF platforms for sharing with lots of your networks. And without further ado, I will jump right into it. So I will start with you, Mark. And Mark, as you would know, based on your experience at the GI Hub, you know that the numbers are not in favor of the PPP model. And according to the GI Hub, PPP private sector investment is at an all-time low and is at about 100 billion and has been steadily declining, as opposed to about the 156 billion we saw in 2010. So with the global decline of PPP transactions or activity, both prior to the pandemic, and we think only exacerbated by the pandemic, but things were not looking good even before then. What propositions do you have for governments to consider in the immediate future to restore the confidence in the PPP model? Over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Pima, for that kind introduction, first of all, and thanks also to the ALSF for the invitation to join the panel. I've had the pleasure of working with the ALSF for many years, going back to when the foundation became one of the supporters of the PPP Legal Resource Center website, which I helped to establish when I was at the World Bank. So we're old friends. Prima, the premise contained in your question in regard to the global decline in the value of PPP transactions is sadly a hard and really undeniable truth. 10 years ago, when the worldwide interest in PPPs seemed to be very high, many of us were optimistic that this particular method of procurement would drive a very significant increase in private sector investment in infrastructure and thereby help to close the global infrastructure gap, particularly in developing countries and emerging markets. But unfortunately, this has not happened. And indeed, the volume of PPP transactions, as you have pointed out, has actually decreased in recent years, even before the onset of the current pandemic. And again, as you noted, this decline is evidenced in the recent Global Infrastructure Hub report. It's called the Inframonitor report, and it provides the numbers that you mentioned, with the total value of the worldwide investment declining since 2010 by more than 30%. And as you said, the level now is only 105 billion US dollars. And the numbers for Sub-Saharan Africa are similarly discouraging. Of that 105 billion that was invested in 2019, only 1.9 billion, less than 2%, took place in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that latter number, that 1.9 billion, is significantly less than the African investment figures in previous years, such as 2012 and 2013. So the issue is, what's causing this loss of confidence in PPPs? And how do we address the problem, given that we desperately need to attract much more private investment if we are going to have any hope of achieving the SDG infrastructure targets by 2030? Now, in my view, it's highly probable that there's a whole variety of reasons why both governments and the private sector are finding PPPs to be unattractive. And those reasons can involve concerns in regard to the complexity of PPPs and the time and effort necessary to properly prepare the transactions. However, I also strongly believe that a key problem area is how we are dealing with the allocation of risk in PPP contracts. And that is because risk allocation is at the very heart of every PPP transaction. And I think our current contracts are simply too inflexible when it comes to the allocation of risk. And that's something I hope we'll get a chance to talk about during the course of today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark. And indeed, we will have to discuss the risk allocation game because it has definitely changed. Let me just jump right to David. And David, you will know, based on both your practice currently and the practice that you've been in for a while, that there is a growing consensus that PPPs need to be more about people. The pandemic could never have shown us better. And so, of course, as a consequence, many proponents of PPPs and governments are increasingly subscribing to strategies to incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals into policies, into planning documents, and into laws, which we all know as the People First approach. So what role do you think the UNECE's People First, what role do you think that the People First approach will play in the African recovery from the pandemic. And if I may just dial back a little, please just explain a little bit more about what People First PPPs are and what role you think they're going to play in the coming months. Over to you, David.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I am very pleased that you invited me. As Mark pointed out, there is some skepticism around the world about PPPs, and there's been a decline in using PPPs to advance development in countries and to also, help countries achieve their sustainable development goals, etc. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe about 4 years ago started exploring this based on a lot of criticism that it was receiving or hearing about PPPs. And in general, the idea was that we need to make PPPs more people-friendly. That's hence the term People First PPPs. What happened was that there was a number of working groups that were put together. I contributed, and I know Beatrice was involved in that as well, where the people started looking at the whole idea that we need to move away just from the value of money or value for money. That is always a concern, but also we should look for value for people, and then also an idea of value for the future. And this basically tied the idea of PPPs, which are long-term projects, as everyone knows, they can be 20 to 30 years in duration, to the idea that we need to have public-private partnerships that are more sustainable and more resilient. And this is really important. So the idea was, it wasn't doing away with the old form of PPPs, it was just improving the approach. And we would look at PPPs to be used specifically as a development tool by countries, which can help countries achieve their sustainable development goals, as previously was stated. And then also to do it in a sustainable way, a responsible way, an area that also, that is answerable to environmental concerns, etc., because there was also great concerns that some PPP projects were having detrimental environmental impacts. The People First PPP focuses also on risk management and risk allocation, as Mark discussed. And so what the People First approach is focusing more and more on is the whole idea of accountability. And is developing a model or a method which will allow for those who are launching projects, as well as governments who are initiating the projects, to look at the whole idea of who's responsible for what? Are we achieving our goals? Are we achieving them in a good manner? And this is critically important in the post-COVID period, where we're facing a situation with limited financial resources and limited government resources. So why not look at projects that are more sustainable, resilient, that are going to last 30 years. Unfortunately, the world is filled with the, how would you call it, the litter or trash of failed PPP projects, and we want to move away from this. So what we're looking at is, ensuring accountability, ensuring proper feasibility studies, ensuring proper approaches that are looking at a multiple set of factors which can influence PPPs. And I feel very strongly that PPPs have a great role, but as PPPs have evolved over the last 20 years, this People First approach or paradigm is not upsetting the apple cart. It's not taking away from the way we do PPPs. I think it's just introducing a paradigm shift that holds governments responsible, and that they don't do prestige projects anymore and projects that countries don't need, but focus on doing projects that countries really do need and which help them achieve their sustainable development goals. And so it helps countries to prioritize and come up with good projects.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. And I think what we seem to be hearing from both you and Mark is that the PPP game is changing, but it's not changing for the worse. The model is only being developed. And we know that models can only be developed after they have been used. So with the risk allocation needing to change, with people first considerations being needed to put in place, the model is only evolving, and we hope that the numbers can turn to our favor. Let me just jump to Beatrice. So Beatrice, we have all heard about the UNECE, and as David was talking about the different things that resilient PPPs and people fast PPPs, could you please explain to the audience what the mandate of the Bureau of the UNECE Working Party on PPPs is? And in your experience, what trends has the Working Party seen concerning PPPs in Africa during the pandemic?
Thank you, Prima, and thank you for ALSF for organizing this webinar, because where I sit, Africa, we need a lot of this kind of conversations, because Africa infrastructure gap is quite wide, and many African governments and participants, we need to be involved in having these conversations about infrastructure in Africa. So in line with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe has different institutions, but the one for public-private partnerships, its objective is to increase expertise of governments to identify, negotiate, manage and implement successful PPP projects. And this is done through exchange of knowledge and experience of PPPs by member states, including experts from public and private sectors, particularly in identifying and testing best practices. The activities normally result into development of standards, guides on best practices, studies and innovative tools that are used normally for capacity building. So the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Bureau of Public-Private Partnerships works through a couple of forums. One of them is the People First that David has been speaking about, whereby we are moving away from looking at value for money, and we are looking at value for people. What is the value the infrastructure asset is going to bring to the people? How economically resourceful is this asset to the people? So basically looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals to see how PPPs can meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals using the People First. And then the UNECE also works through the international PPP Centers of Excellence. And there are a myriad of them. There are some on agriculture, we have on health, education, water, resilient infrastructure, IT and IT, smart cities, renewable energy, transport, and waste management. And then over and above the international PPP centers, there are also what we call the specialist centers. And one of the specialist centers is where David is a senior advisor, that is on resilient and sustainable infrastructure. Others is on smart cities, health, and many others. And they work through the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe PPP Secretariat, and they provide support entirely through the Business Advisory Board, because the UNECE has a Business Advisory Board comprising of various private sector experts with the elaborate experience in infrastructure development. And then you have the editorial board that looks through the different guidelines and standards that have been developed. And then also we have standards and recommendations. So as we look through the different ways of implementing projects, like now we have COVID, the standards and recommendation section looks through the challenges that different institutions and participants are going through in implementation of infrastructure projects. So they recommend standards to guide the implementation of some of these projects. So when they make these recommendations, and then the Bureau look through the benefit and the merit of doing these recommendations, and then we go through the process of developing these guidelines and standards, like we did with the People First PPPs. And then of course, we also have a section where we are looking at case studies. For example, we have case studies across the world, over 500 case studies on People First. What are these projects that we can do through People First? So there's a section that is basically involved in identifying case studies that can be used for informing the decisions on how the infrastructure projects can be implemented. So in brief, that is how the UNECE is organized. And those are the different areas, that thematic areas that the UNECE operates through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. This is just a reminder to all the participants. We're seeing your questions. Please continue sending through those questions. We will have a session for Q&A towards the end, and there are very interesting questions coming in. So the panelists just prepare. It's a very exciting conversation. Let me move to Dr. Tambi. Dr. Tambi is the only probably government representative that we have on this panel. And many times as the ALSF, we want to listen to our governments and to plan for them accordingly, because we do not want to plan without knowing what the exact need is. So Dr. Tambi, as a representative of Sierra Leone and really of many of the African governments, what are the most immediate changes that governments are thinking of making in respect of PPPs in the very near future? So as near as 2021, as near as the coming months, as we look at renegotiation of PPPs, as we look at enabling environments, what are the things that at least Sierra Leone is considering in rescuing really a situation that seems dire? Dr. Tambi, you're muted. Dr. Tambi, you're still muted.
Prima, you might have to send him a text.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent, we can.
Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
No problem.
Thank you for the invitation and thank you to be on this platform. I think before I start, I need to contextualize where we sit as a country and also to indicate that I'm not speaking on behalf of the country. I was speaking as a professional and also as an advisor and not an expert in PPP, but as an infrastructure expert. You see, what is important is that PPP, as is mentioned before, is new to Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa. There is a lack of understanding of what PPP is all about. Most ministries, departments, and agencies do not understand the PPP. For example, our PPP unit was only created in 2014. And in 2014, we had a legislation and a PPP Act. I'm not too sure if many African countries have a PPP legislation or a PPP Act, but that is just to show how new PPP is. For example, also, we only have one PPP project, which to me is not even a successful project. So it's very important that moving forward, in spite of the COVID-19, we try to educate our people what PPP is all about. And also to begin to structure projects so that they could attract the private sector. For example, there's always saying that there's a lot of money around the world, but they cannot find bankable projects in Africa. The issue is not so much bankability of the project. The issue is to make the project attractive enough for the private sector to be a part of it. For example, about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we were able, my office, to at least sign an agreement for a PPP project, which is 270 million for a new airport terminal in the COVID environment. And I think this is a great achievement for a small country like Sierra Leone. But what is important and the lessons learned from that, which we are going to use moving forward, first, we need to structure the projects in such a way that we have adequate cash flows to attract the private sector. And secondly, to have a concession agreement, which is also attractive and long enough for the private sector to regain their money. So moving forward, we are going to educate our people. I think this goes for all African countries. Educate the ministers, the ministries, the department, and the head of the department and agencies to understand clearly what PPP is all about. PPP is not just build, operate, and transfer. PPP is to bring the private sector in the implementation and structuring of projects so that we can fill the infrastructure gap which everybody is talking about. But because of the coronavirus, it has been very difficult for private sector individuals to travel from country to country. So how do we engage the private sector in this environment? We need to now conceptualize our infrastructure project in a holistic manner. Instead of looking at infrastructure in an isolated way, we need to integrate infrastructure development. For example, we talk about transport, energy, ICT. All those should be integrated as a project to attract the private sector. So moving forward, to answer your question, the government would like to educate the masses, not necessarily ministries and MDAs, also the public in the country, to understand what PPP is all about, that we are not giving away our asset, we are just attracting financing so that we can implement critical and transformative infrastructure projects. I think I will stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tambi. And from what I hear from Dr. Tambi, I hope we're not moving too ahead of ourselves, because he's taken us back to the place where we need to educate the masses about what PPPs are and probably get better partnerships between public and private players. Let me move on to Rachel. Rachel, many countries have undergone a lot of reforms, and Dr. Tambi mentioned that, people have set up laws in Sierra Leone. The PPP unit was set up in 2014. And so countries have undergone reforms, they've adopted legal frameworks so as to improve the enabling environment for PPPs. And we hope that these will help to mitigate legal constraints that have caused developers to avoid PPPs in certain markets. So Rachel, based on your years of experience providing legal advice to African governments specifically, what legal, regulatory, and institutional reforms do you recommend for African governments in the near future? Of course, in consideration of, what Dr. Tambi just told us. Thank you.
Thank you, Prima. And again, like the other speakers here, thank you for including me on this very esteemed panel. As you say, many African countries have already set up PPP laws. Many of them are reforming those laws. In fact, you're hard pushed to find countries that haven't actually started in some way to put together a framework to cover PPP, which is great. So you ask, well, what reforms would I suggest that countries put in place? And it's kind of difficult to put a sort of one size fits all, because every country is very different, and every infrastructure sector is also quite different. But maybe I can just speak in sort of general terms, notwithstanding the fact that so many of those countries have established PPP laws and regulations and frameworks. As we've heard, there haven't actually been a significant number of PPP projects to reflect that. So what's going wrong? And some of my colleagues here have talked about some of the issues that maybe impact it, but just looking at some of the legal framework, the really important thing is to make sure that legal framework covers the full life cycle of a project. So how is the project selected? What is the procurement process? What's the contractual framework that people sign up to? And then most importantly, how is it monitored and how does the project develop through its life cycle until it's built and completed and running and operating? So just spending a couple of moments on those various topics, and some of the speakers have already covered this. It's the importance in the legal framework of setting out how a project is selected. Does it fit with the strategic aims of the country? Will it be viable? Will it make money for the private sector to encourage them to bid for it? Will it offer value for money to the country itself? Will it be affordable? Is it something the people want, as we've just heard discussed? Is there actually a suitable pool of bidders who would be qualified and interested in bidding for that project? And so these are the sort of things that can be embedded in the legislation as considerations for working out which projects to take forward. And then, as we've talked about already, we need to find ways of making the PPP process attractive to bidders. So the legislation can help in making that a streamlined process. so that bidders are very clear about the evaluation process, that it's a transparent process, that it's a predictable process, and therefore you'll attract the best bidders to bid for the projects, and the competition is what can really help. And then the contractual matrix is very important, and that will then ensure the project is bankable. Will it attract finance? Does that need to be international finance? Does that need to be continental finance? But without a strong contractual framework, those financial institutions may not be interested in financing the project. And then on an ongoing basis, you need to have in place clear processes for how the project's managed. How do you deal with variations? How do you deal with disputes? It needs to be a very robust mechanism for establishing the performance of the project. Is it meeting the required standards? And alongside the legal framework, you need a strong set of regulations behind it. And those need to be appropriate to particular sectors. What's appropriate to the power sector won't work in healthcare or in roads. So that needs to be specific. And then most importantly, the institutions that back up those laws and regulations. And a number of our speakers today have much more experience than I do with those institutions. But those institutions need to be empowered and have the skilled people as part of them to help evaluate the projects, bring them to the market, and help advise the government ministries. And I know that this is a topic that's dear to Prima, the ALSF's heart, in terms of capacity building among those institutions to really ensure that they're robust. You know, and aside from that, in terms of other reforms, anything that encourages the investment environment, you know, outside of the simple PPP laws, is going to encourage investment in the country and is going to be beneficial to the promotion of PPP projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And what I seem to hear from you is that we have the laws in place, we have the institutions in place, we have the regulations in place, but what we need to be thinking about is implementation, and governments need to actually walk the talk. So, you know, sort of walk the talk. Whatever is written in the laws, etc., needs to actually be practiced. So I think our time is moving quite quickly. I'll just move on to Mark, and I'll circle back to Mark on a question and a point that he mentioned about the risk allocation. And Mark, we said that we know that risk allocation needed to change, and it also, the pandemic has also sort of, you know, brought it to light. So we know that the game has changed, and I'll just ask you to expound on how you think the pandemic has changed the risk allocation game and what practitioners should be thinking as opposed to running to the usual matrix.
Thanks, Prima. In my view, what the pandemic has dramatically illustrated is actually an issue that's been growing in the minds of both governments and private sector investors for a number of years, namely that the risks associated with PPP transactions can be both extreme and unpredictable, and that our current PPP contracts do not handle risk allocation in a way that is working effectively for all of the concerned parties. Traditionally, the process for drafting a PPP contract is to develop a so-called risk matrix document, which itemizes every risk that the lawyers believe might happen during the life of the project, with each risk being assigned to either the public sector or the private sector party. Now, normally, because government lawyers draft the PPP contract, at least in the first instance, only a few risks are retained by the public sector, with most of the risks transferred to the private sector project company. And traditionally, only a small number of risks are shared by the two parties. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, I think the basic problem with this arrangement is that it's inflexible. No matter how talented your legal drafting team is, they can never predict everything that may happen during the lifetime of a 20 or 30-year PPP highway project or PPP hospital project. For example, the lawyers might not have thought about what should happen in the event of a global pandemic. So as a result, when an unpredicted and perhaps unpredictable risk arises, the project becomes in trouble. And frequently, this can lead to a dispute between the parties, which in turn might well result in an arbitration and ultimately the termination of the contract, and the ALSF gets involved and everybody else. Alternatively, it might result in one of the parties seeking a renegotiation of the contract, a process that presents its own set of problems. So against that background, I was recently asked by the Asian Development Bank to take a look at different contractual models that have been used for infrastructure and other sectors to see if a better approach might be available. The Asian Development Bank has now published my paper on this topic, and if anyone would like to read it, I can send them the link. Now, in that paper, I looked at a whole variety of models such as project partnering, alliance contracting, integrated project delivery, and various hybrid PPP models that have been used in different countries. And the conclusion that I reached is that we do not, I emphasize that, we do not need to abandon PPPs, but we should try to make them more flexible and more collaborative. Specifically, we should selectively increase the number of situations where risks are shared by the contracting parties, recognizing a fundamental truth that PPPs are supposed to be partnership agreements, agreements between partners working together to provide the infrastructure services. I also suggested that we take a fresh look at how disputes are handled in PPP transactions, and I recommended that greater use be made of so-called dispute resolution boards, which have been successfully employed in the construction industry to quickly and efficiently resolve disputes, and indeed can even help to prevent incipient problems from becoming serious disputes. My paper was commissioned by the ADB to provide guidance to countries in Asia, but I very strongly believe that the recommendations in the paper are equally relevant to Africa. We need to have contracts that are more flexible and more collaborative.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we've had the message loud and clear. We need to start thinking flexibility and collaboration. Let me come back to David, and we're also receiving a lot of questions, David, regarding people first PPPs. But my question right now is, given the fiscal constraints that Africa is facing, just, you know, we've faced fiscal constraints for a long time, but the pandemic has really exacerbated this. How do you reconcile the idea of wanting to build green PPPs that are seen as more expensive and cost-friendly PPPs?
Thank you for the question. So I think there's one mystery or misunderstanding that exists, and that is that PPPs can be free or that PPPs can be cheaper than other projects at times. What I see, the result is that we need to look at a long-term commitment, and Mark Mosley and previous speakers have talked about that. So we need to look at projects that are going to survive in the long term. And one of the best ways to do this is through people first PPPs, because we are very focused on sustainability, resilience, addressing people's needs. If you address people's needs in projects, then they are going to use it. And that's one of the ways to guarantee also that a project has a healthy revenue stream. The other aspect is that when you bring the private sector in, but you're asking them to think about people as, you know, as part of the equation, it's also going to bring about innovation. PPP is all about introducing innovation from the private sector, and this needs to be built in. Unfortunately, what has happened in certain governments is that they have asked for innovation. And then when the procurement takes place and then a project is innovative, sometimes it's a little more expensive. And then the innovative candidate loses out and is not selected because of cost considerations. And I think that is rather short-term thinking, because if we're thinking of the survivability of the project, don't we want to invest up front so that in 20 years or 30 years time, we still have a project that is working? We also need, the standards that Beatrice has mentioned, that Rachel has mentioned, as Mark has mentioned, creating the enabling environment, the law structure, the legal system. And so this is critically important. But I don't think you can do a people first study or people first PPP until you've done a comprehensive feasibility study. So we should not avoid those. And, this is a challenge, but there are different places to, find funding for a feasibility study. This will allow us and allow governments to reprioritize PPPs and really just do projects which are needed. It was also, if you have a genuine process for people first projects where you're looking for certain things above what other projects look for, I think you are going to engage good players in the process. You want to recruit, as Mark said, good partners who have the project at heart and who are interested. And this will help, greater success. I would like to just end in saying that I don't think cost-friendly means cheap. But in the long run, cost-friendly means projects that will deliver, that will be survivable, that will offer value, and again, offer value, not just in value for money, but value for people, and will also be future-proofed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And one of the questions in the Q&A is an example of a people first PPP. So I'll let you think about that and we'll circle back to that. Moving over to you, Beatrice. In our work as the ALSF, one of the recurring reasons we have had from governments for aversion to the PPP model is the length of time it simply takes to implement a PPP. And they're often seen as a lengthy solution for African governments that need to really work quickly and meet growing needs. So in your opinion, what techniques can African governments implement to speed up PPPs while working efficiently and not losing accuracy? Beatrice, you are muted. Beatrice, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I wanted to say that I want to pick from where John left, because, PPPs are quite complex and lengthy, like you mentioned, but you can't understand something which is lengthy and complex if you don't know it. So PPP capacities across Africa are quite limited, right from the top. And in corporate governance, they say the tone is set from the top. So if the top does not understand the PPP, first of all, the framework, the PPP process, the project preparation, it's very hard for the process to be, first of all, shortened. So where I sit, I think the first thing we need to do is PPP capacity building, right from the top. So I am honored and privileged to be speaking to LSF today, and you have a mandate to assist many African governments negotiate and structure complex infrastructure projects over and above PPPs. I think as you do that, one of the key issues you need to do across Africa is the PPP capacity building. Because the moment you have everybody in the dancing hall understanding the music you're playing, then it makes it easy for you to play the music, just a little bit of it, and people understand the side where you want to go. For example, if you say you want to shorten the PPP life cycle, for example, from inception, feasibility study, as Rachel mentioned, the commercial clauses, for example, if you want to look at the risks. Now, when you bring in the people first aspects, and as I speak, from the UNECE, we have developed evaluation methodology for the people first projects. So first of all, we need to bring people up to speed with the PPPs. Then we have to bring people up to speed with the people first, then you have to bring people up to speed with the various evaluation methodologies. So I think in order to shorten this process, we first need to build the capacities. Capacities from the government point of view, right from the presidents to the ministers, to the permanent secretaries, to understand exactly what is required when they're doing PPPs. If you look at Ministry of Finance, for example, they need to understand, like for the fiscal commitments and contingent liability management framework, what is involved if they engage in a PPP transaction? What are the fallback positions government has in case the PPP does not fail? So shortening the process is not enough. It's important for the government to understand what is required to have a well-prepared project. After they have understood what is required in having a well-prepared project, they're turning it. The other thing I would think African governments need to do is have a political champion. Most often, these PPP projects in Africa, as you mentioned, they're lengthy. And you find either PPP unit head or one government official who is championing this project might be the sole candidate in the forest. So you're toying the forest or working in the forest alone. There's nobody who understands what you're doing. So you need a political champion to help you in the boardrooms, to help you in cabinet, to help you in parliament, to help you in all these forums to say that we need this project implemented. We need this project approved. We need this financing approved. We need this law approved to ensure that there's a framework to do X, Y, Z. But if you don't have a political champion to champion the process all through, you find that the process ends up being so lengthy because people don't understand exactly what you require. Then also the technical expertise. Most often you find governments, when they engage in PPP transactions, they want to go for the lowest bid. Whether the team is qualified or not, they just want to go for the lowest bid. And then you end up having a project that is not well prepared. You find a project where the contract clauses are not actually a representative of what should be done in the project implementation or process. You find that the financing of the project is not up to the expectations. So you find midway the project fails, or the project takes long to be implemented. Then maybe the other thing we could consider is maybe having some standard documents for some of the projects. We can look at maybe sector by sector, but this is after we have undertaken the capacity building. So in my view, that's, I think, what should be done. So capacity building is a critical aspect that needs to be looked at. The moment we have capacity building addressed right from the top up to the officers who are actually preparing the projects, then we can see how we can look at how to shorten the process when everybody understands what is required in the PPP preparation process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beatrice. I think you've spoken right to Dr. Tambi's point about capacity building being very important. We need a political champion and the need for technical expertise. Dr. Tambi, let me come back to you. Has the pandemic changed the way that your country, Sierra Leone, intends to approach PPP projects in the future, in particular to cope with possible future exogenous shocks? Dr. Tambi, you are muted. Good.
Yes, thank you very much. The pandemic has certainly made a difference. But what is important, we need to recognize that PPP is not cheap. And they can never be cheap because infrastructure projects are not cheap and they take a long time to develop. It's because of that, in my opinion, the private sector should be part and parcel of the feasibility process for a project. Because you're not going to allow government to do the feasibility study, and at the end of it, they're looking for privates to be part of it. So my office was designed and created to plan, design, and implement strategic and transformative infrastructure projects. Recognizing that the government does not have the borrowing capacity, all our projects are based on PPPs. I agree with the past speakers talking about capacity building, but capacity building is not enough. People need to see practical PPP projects that are beneficial to society. I think that is what is lacking in most of the continent. We don't have enough PPP projects that are practical and beneficial, notwithstanding the cost. So what we need to do, and based on the pandemic, we recognize that not all projects are amenable for PPPs. No matter how you structure them, they can never pay for themselves, no matter how critical they are. So we have tried to identify the projects that are amenable to PPP, and then would also, I don't agree with some of the procurement processes. I think before you go for procurement for a private sector in a group to be part of a project, you should bring them on board after you conceive the project. From the concept stage, you should now begin to solicit potential private sector individuals who would like to partner with you to do the pre-feasibility and feasibility to structure it well. It does not necessarily mean that they will take it all to the end, but at least you have the private sector angle as you prepare your project. This is what we also recognize. Unfortunately, the pandemic is making it difficult, but my office has been working in that method. And now, based on the cash flow that we've been projecting, the pandemic has made it to jump out of the window. So what has that done to us? It has told us that in order to plan, you have to have scenarios, worst case scenarios, best case scenarios, even though no legal or no planning can satisfy what will happen in the future. But at least you can see some of the scenarios. That is what we are looking at the worst case scenario, best case scenario, using the private sector in our feasibility studies, in our pre-feasibility studies. So the pandemic has taught us that we need to partner with the private sector before we even go out with the feasibility study looking for partners to jump on it. The second thing that we also recognize, we need to improve our connectivity, internet connectivity, because you can see there's challenges in most African countries to stay connected. We need to invest in the internet connectivity to make sure that we can continue to have our Zoom meetings, we can continue to speak to people out of here, and we can continue to also transmit data without physically being at the same place. Those are some of the lessons we've learned. And unfortunately, the pandemic has been with us. So that is how we are working in my office. For example, like I said, we just signed an agreement for $270 million project, airport project. Our cash flow analysis may be wrong by now, but what we have done, we try to increase the concession period to make up for the shortfall in the cash flow. So there should be flexibilities in all the agreements moving forward. I agree with the last speakers, the past speakers, that the project, the agreement be flexible to attract the private sector. But it's important for the private sector to be on board from day one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tambi, for that very spirited submission. And we're fast approaching the 1 hour mark. Time does fly when you're having fun. Please feel free to continue to send through the questions. We should be moving to the Q&A session very soon. But before we can do that, let me just move to Rachel. At the beginning of the pandemic, force majeure was a buzzword everywhere, and rightly so. In your experience, has the definition of force majeure evolved? And if so, how can African governments plan for this in the coming months?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, Prima. You're right. In March and in April, I'm not sure how many conferences and seminars and memos were circulated about force majeure and what it meant. And it seems to have quietened down a bit, but I can track just a few trends that I think have happened over recent months in relation to force majeure. And what I'll just say for this audience, we've got to remember the difference between force majeure in a common law jurisdiction like many on this call, and also the difference in civil law jurisdictions. So for example, that's some of the Francophone countries, because people will remember that force majeure is actually set in the civil code of a number of the Francophone jurisdictions, and they actually set out what force majeure means. But that's not the case in common law jurisdictions, which English law is the same. So it's not a term of art in English law, force majeure. So what that's meant is that contracts need to set out very clearly what is meant by force majeure, what is a force majeure event. And so they need to set out what it means, and also to set out what the consequences are of a force majeure event happening. So what's happened and what's evolved over recent months? I think the thing to look at is that the definition of what constitutes force majeure has really evolved and become a lot more detailed. I think everybody has rushed to make sure that their force majeure event includes the word pandemic or epidemic. So they have become a lot more detailed with, and I think, I can't remember who said it now, but actually maybe it was you, David, talking about flexibility of projects, that you just can't anticipate all the eventualities that are going to happen. But I think what's happened in recent months is that people have tried to anticipate all those possible force majeure events and put them into the definitions, and then really think about, well, what are the consequences of those events happening, and trying to anticipate that. So other things just worth flagging for the lawyers on the call, they may be familiar with FIDIC, which is it's a form of construction contract that's used in a number of World Bank projects, and sets out a number of standard terms for a construction contract. And they've actually recently moved away from using the term force majeure, and they've actually put in place exceptional events clause. And I think that's to try and disassociate it with some of those civil code definitions of what force majeure includes. So I think that's another interesting development. And the other thing I think to bear in mind that people, you know, in their rush to say I've had a force majeure event, that we've been looking at quite closely, is the force majeure event needs to actually have caused a problem. So it's not enough to say, oh, there's been a pandemic and you know, you must let me off my contract. You've actually got to demonstrate that the event itself has caused the problem. So again, there's a few going back to basics, working out again what force majeure means, what its consequences are, and trying to describe it in a very thorough way now in documents.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We have a number of questions coming in from the panel, from the audience, and so I might have to go off script a bit. But just before I do that, I'll come back to you, Mark, and ask for a recommendation on sectors that you think African governments need to begin thinking about that have really been brought to light because of the pandemic.
Thanks, Prima, and I'll try and be brief. Of course, every country in Africa is going to have its own priorities in terms of what infrastructure projects are best suited to PPP transactions. And of course, there are tools that governments can use to help with this process, such as the Global Infrastructure Hub's Infrastructure Outlook tool. However, I had to pick one sector on which all governments, I think, can usefully focus, both in developing countries and indeed even in advanced economies, I'm going to agree with Dr. Tamby. It's digital infrastructure. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us about the critical importance of digital connectivity. We've discovered that communities that have strong broadband connectivity can function even during complete pandemic lockdowns, with people working from home, with students being educated remotely, and even with a variety of health services being delivered by telemedicine, to say nothing of holding conferences like this. In other words, we may not be using our roads or our trains or our airports as much as we did before, but we can still function if, and only if, we have that connectivity. But the majority of the world does not have affordable and reliable digital connectivity. Indeed, 3.6 billion people lack broadband access to the internet. And the problem's not just in developing and emerging economies. As I said, in my own country of Canada, it's amazing that fully 60% of the rural population does not currently have broadband access. So that's why the government of Canada has recently launched a new digital connectivity initiative. And that is why programs such as the Digital Moonshot for Africa, which is sponsored jointly by the African Union and by the World Bank, those programs are critically important. And this is a sector where I think it's clearly obvious that private sector investment can and should happen. Accordingly, I'd urge governments throughout Africa to participate very actively in the Digital Moonshot program. I think it's critically important.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I will now move to the Q&A session, and I'll move right to you, David. So someone in the audience has asked what your views on micro PPPs in Africa is.
You just repeat, was it on micro PPPs you said, or?
Yes, your views on micro PPPs in Africa.
So I think if I understand the question, these are smaller PPPs, and the challenge there obviously is, getting investors interested. The transactional costs of PPPs can be quite costly. And so if you're going to go through a process of trying to set up a very elaborate contract and elaborate negotiations and feasibility studies, and that it might kill the micro project before it even has a chance to get off the ground. But I think if you start looking at the whole idea of bundling of these projects, and so you find a way to combine them. So for example, in the United States, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, for example, the state there issued a whole series of micro projects for little local bridges and culverts across roads. There's about 500 of them in the state, and they didn't want to, they didn't have the resources to fund it. So they looked at their funding gap, reached out to investors, and they bundled this. So there were some financial companies that were interested in investing. And so they got bunches or groups or tranches that were issued, and they got, 100 bridges. And then it made it sort of a viable aspect. You can do that also with schools. To do one school is not always a good example, but if you bundle 10 schools together and put it out as a contract, the same with, which is critically important in Africa, are healthcare systems and healthcare clinics. So I know, for example, in countries like Lesotho and that, they've also looked at bundling them. So it's a fine balance. People want to go after the big, sexy projects, where they can invest 100, 200, 300, $5 billion, whatever. And then it's the local ones, $5, $6 million, which fall under the radar screen. And I think one thing that governments can also do with micro projects is to reach out to domestic investors who are going to be more interested in these smaller projects, because I don't think big international investors are going to look at a $5 million project in a country, but there's a lot of interest from domestic investors. And I also think, and I'll end there, with members of the African diaspora like me, who are very concerned about Africa and, would find those type of projects more interesting to invest in.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. And you do make a good point that domestic investors will probably be the best investors for this. In my former life, I did a lot of private equity work, and we had lots of private equity investors come into the country and look for projects. And the problem was always a small ticket size, where even just giving $1 million to a farmer somewhere would scare them off. So I agree with you that these are projects that should probably be taken on by local investors. I will move to you, Beatrice, on a question that has come in from the audience. which is how is value for people measured and quantified? Value for money is easy, but how do we quantify value for people? Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Prima, for that question. Like I mentioned during my discussion, the value for, the people first PPP guidelines have just come through, and we have developed the evaluation methodology for people first projects. So we look at various aspects. First of all, we look at the stakeholder engagement. How far have you undertaken the stakeholder engagement for the project to ensure that people's demands have been listened to? For example, you have to look at aspects like affordability. How far have you done the affordability for the project? Then you have to look at the aspects of poverty. To what extent is the project addressing aspects of poverty? You have to look at aspects of environmental sustainability. To what extent is the project addressing aspects of environmental sustainability? So this is in an evaluation methodology, which is in an Excel format. So you key in the different variables in the Excel format, and then you'll get a result to find out whether your project is suitable for implementation under a PPP arrangement. You also look at aspects like equity, especially the women. To what extent have you involved women in your project? And also, to what extent have your projects addressed the demands, especially of the women? Because if you look at, for example, the water infrastructure projects, most of them, they are designed in such a way that the project is not moving closer, because, you know, as an African, if there is no water, you find the woman has to carry water up to the bathroom. The woman needs water in the kitchen. The woman needs water in several aspects. So to what extent has your project addressed those aspects of the challenges faced by the women, faced by the youth, faced by the people with disabilities? You also have to look at the aspect of sustainability. To what extent is your project sustainable? So there are various aspects that are in the methodology. I am happy to share that. I'll just check with my team if it is a version that is shareable now, because we are actually going to test that evaluation methodology across various countries in Africa and also across the world. Many other governments in Europe as well are going to test this methodology. So this methodology is going to be available, and also the training on people first. What David didn't mention is the training on people first principle, how actually we are going to assess projects using people first. First of all, how do I identify a project that is a people first project? So where the project actually meets that. It's a training that we have to undertake. And in the process of undertaking that training, we shall also bring in the evaluation methodology to ensure that the different stakeholders understand how to use the people first principles, but also in assessing the projects and the evaluation methodology.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Beatrice. And we hear you on the fact that there's a methodology, and as soon as it's available to the world, it will definitely be shared. Let me move to Dr. Tambi. A question from the audience is, and this specifically came from a person that has worked at a PPP agency, and they asked, what, if any, tactics can be embedded in PPPs to fight corruption? Dr. Tambi, please unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. See, corruption cannot be tackled just through PPP. Corruption is endemic in every fabric of society. Every fabric of society will have corruption. I still maintain that until you have a demonstrable, successful PPP project that is without corruption, you cannot promote PPP in any African country. Now, how do we fight corruption? Through the procurement processes, and also through the agreement. But if you're trying to fight corruption in isolation just through PPP, you will never succeed. corruption has to be fought at all fronts, from the conception of the project to the selection of the project as a government national priority. That is why you start to minimize the influence of corruption. But to answer your question, PPP alone cannot solve the corruption issue, cannot fight corruption, but you can minimize corruption in the way you select your project, the way you conceive your project, and the way you structure your project. I hope I've answered that adequately enough.
Yes, Dr. Tambi, what we hear you saying is that we have to fight corruption along the entire PPP value chain. And it cannot be done in isolation for only PPPs, but it has to be something that is fought in the fabric of society. Let me move to you, Rachel. Someone is asking, from a continental perspective, are you seeing an appetite for infrastructure regeneration?
I mean, there's certainly a need for it, without a doubt. I think the issue that we've probably picked up a bit on this call is actually the difficulty of turning that need into actual viable PPP projects that can be executed, that attract bidders and financing. And, you know, that comes back, I guess, to the heart of what we've been discussing today. How can we make projects more attractive, more streamlined, more affordable, you know, to everyone, that being domestic bidders, international bidders, anyone, frankly, who's qualified.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. And I'll move right back to Mark, where somebody in the audience is asking, does the decline of PPP contracts depend on their complexity, on lack of skills, or simply the decline of infrastructure projects in general? So are we just seeing the fact that, you know, there's no infrastructure projects in general, or is it specific things that are causing a decline in PPP contracts? And on the back of that, they've asked, have there been many projects eligible for PPP, but which have rather been awarded in the traditional way?
Sorry, I think it's clear that the complexity is a deterrent to PPPs. I think that is a problem area. I think that the skills, as other speakers have noted, Beatrice particularly, again, that's a problem area that we need to address. But in terms of a decline in infrastructure projects generally, I don't see a decline, certainly not in the demand. The demand is there. We're a long way from reaching sustainable development goals. So the demand is there, and we need to figure out a way of meeting that demand. The business of projects going ahead that should be PPP projects, but are being done as traditional public works projects. Yes, indeed, that's happening because of this lack of enthusiasm or loss of confidence in PPPs. But we're also seeing some interesting experiments being done in various countries around the world where governments have decided, as partly in response to the slowness of getting PPP projects started, and partly in order to attract more investors, particularly institutional investors, we're seeing governments taking an approach where they build the project as a traditional public works project, have it operate for a couple of years so as to demonstrate that it is a viable project, and then offer it to the private sector as an already built and functioning infrastructure asset. This is very attractive to many investors, again, particularly institutional investors, such as pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, because the projects have in effect been de-risked. The most risky part of any project, infrastructure project, is the construction phase and the first few years of operation. So by going ahead with these projects as traditional public works projects and then offering a 20 or 30-year operations and maintenance concession, governments have been trying to get around this. Now, there's some trade-offs. You don't get all of the benefits of a PPP by doing this. But governments in India, in the Philippines, and there's a new program in Indonesia, have been looking at this hybrid approach to doing PPPs.
Thank you very much, Mark. And somebody is asking for the paper you mentioned on the Asian Development Bank. We will share their details so that that paper can be shared. But I will move to you, David, quickly. We just have 5 minutes before we can close and before we can begin wrapping this up. Mark, David, what is asking, what role do you see technology services playing in PPPs, especially in the analysis management and in the implementation? I know that Mark had mentioned something about this earlier, but we will hear from you, David. Just add your voice to it.
Hi there. I think any tool that helps to do concise analysis and shortens the the need for a heavy team of analysts to work through the feasibility of a project is valuable. It also helps when you have these tools for standardization, because then you don't have 15 people doing it in 15 different ways. You will have a standard approach. There are many tools out there to be used. For example, the World Bank's PFRAM tool, which is a really good tool for identifying and quantifying and determining risk on projects, is an excellent tool if people haven't used it. One of my favorite tools is the Global Infrastructure Hub's risk profile sort of tool that you can go in and put in the type of project, etc., and it will list all different types of risks. So you're not spending a lot of time trying to invent or reinvent the wheel. You're taking the wheel that already exists and you're turning it from a wooden wheel to a pneumatic tire. So it's going from a much smoother approach. So the only challenge, I think, is that some of these tools and technology platforms are a little complex and sometimes will require training to be able to use them effectively, because the tool's there, but it still requires good input and good manipulation of the tool. So, reach out, find out, and I would agree with, what Beatrice said, even with capacity building, that it's not just building teams, but it's building the capacity and finding the tools and the mechanisms to use. And if you go to PPIAF and the World Bank, you go to the Asian Development Bank site, there are numerous tools. Just take some time, explore them, discover them, find them. And if you need help, many of those institutions provide training on how to use them effectively.
Thank you, David. The information is available and only needs to be used. Let me come back to you, Dr. Tambi. Someone is asking, how do you see the opportunity universe post-COVID-19 in Africa? So what opportunities do you see for PPPs post-COVID-19 as an African government?
As an African government, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Dr. Tambi. Yes, we can.
You can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes.
See, given their limited capacity to borrow and the limited resources, but also the competing sectorial demands, I think PPP is the only way to go if Africa has to develop, especially in the infrastructure sector. The challenge that we have, see, most African governments are used to EPC plus financing. That's the traditional way of implementing infrastructure project. We need to change that mindset. Post-COVID-19, we need to change that mindset, improve and invest on our connectivity and ICT, and then begin to structure projects so that they could attract the private sector. I think, in my opinion, that is the only way we can go. And there's a lot of opportunities because now God has been very kind to us. The death rate in Sub-Saharan Africa has been very minimal compared to the rest of the world. We have survived, I can say we survived COVID-19. But most African countries, especially in the interior, they don't even know that there's COVID-19. So we are continuing to live as if it does not exist, or we continue to live like we are going to continue to live with it. So we have a best destination for investors to put their money in. But what we lack, and which is what we need to improve on, is to structure our project, educate our people that PPP is not giving everything away. PPP is to minimize risk and to spread the risk. It's not cheap, but at the end of the day, it could be cheaper than the traditional way of doing things. In my opinion, infrastructure sector, the ICT sector, and agricultural sector are the most, are the best candidates for PPP attraction. When I say PPP attraction, I'm not going to limit it to out of Africa, even within Africa. It's something we should look at. I'm optimistic, notwithstanding the COVID-19, that Africa is the best destination for PPP project to take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tambi, for those encouraging words. For us that are based on the continent, it's the best destination. We don't know about you, Mark and David, but there's no COVID here. I will just ask Rachel one last question. We're really out of time, and we will prepare our closing statements and call it a day. So Rachel, someone is asking, what are your thoughts on closing the currency gaps in PPP projects? I'll just let you have a minute to respond to that.
Yeah, so I think the question is perhaps asking about whether they can be done on local currency or whether everything has to be done on US dollars or some other international currency. And I think that goes to the discussion we had earlier about, generally anything that can improve the investment environment in a country is going to encourage investment in that country. So anything that can be done to improve the transferability of currency is going to help encourage investment there. Of course, the other issues we've got on the continent is there are some developed financial centers, like South Africa has a very well developed banking sector, which is successful, and Kenya perhaps as well, and some other jurisdictions. So perhaps it's about developing those local hubs as well.
Thank you, Rachel. And with our remaining 3 minutes, I will ask the panelists to please give us their closing remarks. I will start with you, David.
Well, I think PPPs have a great future in Africa. We just must ensure that they do not become nationalization of debt and privatization of profit. These need to be good profit. These need to be good partnerships. I also believe that they offer a great opportunity for technology leapfrogging, because innovation and innovators will introduce new technologies that Africa hasn't built, and they can build it cheaper, better, and inefficiently based on lessons learned in other countries. And then I think we should not be shy of using our human resources as well. I'm amazed when I was the director of IP3, we trained thousands of people from Africa to implement PPPs, and we've contributed to the capacity building, and it would be just great if those big companies would give Africans the chance to be part of the PPP teams as well.
Thank you very much, David. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Prima. I'll try and be really brief. I'm going to emphasize the first point that I make, that I think all of us need to take a fresh look at the issue of risk allocation in our PPP contracts and how we're handling a dispute resolution. And the objective should be to try and make PPP transactions more flexible, more collaborative, and accordingly, more attractive and more resilient. As I said, there's a paper on this in the chat room. I've now put a link to that paper so that everybody can access it. I'm also going to emphasize one other point, particularly for the government representatives. I think it's important to concentrate on the efficiency of our infrastructure assets, both the existing ones and the new ones. And we can do that by taking a hard look at the governance arrangements that are in place in terms of infrastructure management. Beatrice and others have spoken about this. There's two great new publications that I really recommend to people. The IMF published a book last month called Well Spent: How Strong Infrastructure Governance Can End Waste in Public Investment. It's freely available on the IMF website. And the World Bank has just released the new 2020 version of its infrastructure benchmarking report. Again, it provides guidance to governments on governance measures that can be taken, which can significantly help efficiency, significantly improve, as we would say in North America, the bang for the buck that you're getting for your infrastructure investments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, and for the recommendation of resources. Beatrice, your closing remarks?
Thank you very much, Prima. My closing remarks would be basically to sincerely give appreciation to African Legal Support Facility for this great initiative, because in Africa, we need this kind of discussions, because all the issues that have been raised by the distinguished panel of speakers are critical for different African governments to listen to. You know, the Africa infrastructure gap is between 130 and 160 billion dollars. And such discussions as contract dispute resolution, assessing risks, capacity building, looking into efficiencies, basically having political champions. I believe working together with the Africa Public-Private Partnership Network and many other institutions within Africa, we shall be able to bridge the Africa infrastructure gap and try to bring a smile on many of the African citizens who are actually do not have infrastructure. If there's any infrastructure at all, it's very limited, and it is high time that Africa, we need to look at these infrastructure challenges with a broader lens and see how best we can improve the infrastructure gap in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Over to you, Rachel.
Oh, just very briefly, I'd really just echo what the other panelists have said. You know, from the legal perspective, laws are there, the regulations are there, it's on paper. We've got to figure out a way of translating it from paper into real life. And part of that is around the capacity building and some of the other good objectives that Beatrice just talked about.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Dr. Tambi, your closing remarks, please.
Thank you for having me here. I think it is very important that we talk about PPP. You see, Africa can only develop if we change the way we do things from the past. And I believe we can have all the capacity of training, all the capacity building, until we see practical, regional, and national infrastructure project, major infrastructure projects that are being done through PPP. It's going to be difficult to sell PPP on the continent. We need to see demonstrable project, regional projects, national projects that are successful and are done through PPP. That is what we need, and that will get us moving. So thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tambi. Like I said, time does fly. We had loads of questions, both pre-prepared as well as questions that have come in from the audience. Unfortunately, we have not been able to ask all these questions, but we will have a series of ALSF panels, and you will be informed through the various channels of upcoming PPP panels. But the coming months will be very critical for governments in dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. The one thing that our discussion today has at least revealed is that governments will have to be very creative, innovative, and adaptable. Based on the options discussed by our panelists and the invaluable contribution of our audience, we know that this can be done. The time for PPPs is not yet over. I want to thank the ALSF team that has worked hard to put this together on the back end. And I definitely want to say thank you to our panelists for such a vibrant and informative discussion. And thank you to everyone that tuned in. Au revoir. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.